Good day, everybody. We are currently just sorting out some tech issues. It's kind of the requisite moment where we sort out both the limitations and the possibilities of these wonderful and perplexing digital formats. But I'm just going to begin the process of introducing our session today, which I am enormously honored to host. Adele Perry Ndishnakas, Gawin Nidudimsi, Winnipeg Ninduji, Zaganash Kwe Ninda. My name's Adele Perry. I don't know my clan. I live in Winnipeg. I'm a white woman, a settler historian. I'm based here at the University of Manitoba in the departments of history and women's and gender studies. And I also have the honor of being the director of the Center for Human Rights Research. And it is in all of those capacities that I have the real privilege of beginning this session. And this session is the first of a series of what we've called critical conversations into historic wrongs and human rights and historic wrongs. And these happen in the particular space not far away from the Assiniboine River and the territories of the Anishinaabe and Innu people and of the Métis Nation, governed by the promises of both Treaty 1 and of the Manitoba Act. And it is amidst these histories that we inherit, that we live in the teeth of, and that we try and change, that we do this work. The Center for Human Rights Research was established a decade ago. And one of the things that the center did for a long time was run courses and seminar series in conjunction. And these were appropriately called critical conversations. This year, we are making our first effort to do so online. And this opens up all sorts of possibilities to welcoming folks that we had not previously able to welcome to our space. And we are particularly lucky this year to be taking on these questions about the relationship between what I've called, for better or for worse, historic rights and human wrongs. And what we're focusing on is how historians and public history professionals have addressed or failed to address a wide range of historical events and processes that might be considered under the broad tent of human rights violations or atrocities within the context of Canada and the territories that preceded it. How have scholars and public history professionals, both inside and outside of the academy, addressed a historical record and a present that includes slavery, dispossession, incarceration, forced removal, starvation, and a range of other difficult and troubling histories? How have the language of human rights that have circulated since the post-war era helped to shape historians and public history professionals' responses to these histories? And what are the limits and the possibilities of frameworks of human rights and Indigenous rights for accounting for and engaging with a range of difficult histories in the context of Canada and the territories that preceded us? We have what I think is a stellar program this term. In a little bit of time, hopefully I should be able to share my screen and show it to you. But we are especially honored to be able to have Dr. Robert Innes as our inaugural guest speaker of the series. Dr. Innes is Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science and the Indigenous Studies program at McMaster University in the Hammer. He's also affiliated with the University of Saskatchewan, where he taught for more than a decade and was chair for a while there of the Indigenous Studies program. Dr. Innes is Nihayu. He has a PhD from the University of Arizona and is the author of a number of important works, including his foundational 2013 book, Elder Brother and the Law, that the class that meets in conjunction with this series will be reading from today. More recently, Dr. Innes is the author of a number of critical articles and the co-editor of Indigenous Celebrity, Indigenous Entanglements with Fame, and the Arts of Indigenous Health and Wellbeing, which is launching tonight at the University of Manitoba Press. So this is for Dr. Innes and all University of Manitoba, all work, all day sort of Monday. And I encourage everybody to go over to the UM Press website and log in for that event tonight. Today, Dr. Innes will be speaking on questions that convey Indigenous historical perspectives and that challenge how Canadians view Indigenous history. We are enormously honored that he will be joining us and sharing this with us. We will have a presentation which will be recorded. After that, we're going to have some questions and some answers. And after that, the students who are here as part of the class will be joining me back again for the remainder of our class. But the rest of you should all be done at 3:30, 3:45. And again, I will turn things over to Rob. We are working on getting the screen share going. I hope that works. And in the meantime, I'll pass things over to him and get working on that. And thank you very much.
Tanse Kisinu Machewan Kaheyu Nitsikasan, Cowesses First Nation, Ochinia. My name is Rob Innes. I'm a member of Cowesses First Nation, located in Treaty 4 territory. And I am coming to you from Hamilton, Ontario, territory of the Haudenosaunee and Mississauga, and covered by the spoon with one, the dish with one spoon covenant agreement. I'd like to thank Professor Perry and the CHRR for this invitation to come speak today. I wish I was there at the University of Manitoba. I have a lot of fond memories. My mom used to work there at the engineering access program on campus for many years. And I used to, spend many a time just running around the tunnels. So I have a lot of good memories of the U of M. How did we fix it? Do we know?
We have not yet fixed it. We're working on it. I will give you a shout when we fixed it.
Okay.
I hate to say this. I'm not sure if it can be fixed once the meeting has started. I am trying.
Oh, okay. Okay. So that's not a problem.
Okay, if worse comes to worse, we may all have to stop the meeting and start again, which would be interesting, and we would learn something from that experience. But I'm hopefully we'll figure it out. So hang tight, and thanks again for this, Dr. Innes.
Okay, so I'll just go from here and start. My talk is titled. It's kind of a long, winding kind of title, questions that convey Indigenous perspectives that challenge how Canadians view Indigenous history. I'm not sure why I came up with that title, but I did. And so in 1985, UCLA anthropologist Nasha Hanef noted that the anthropological literature characterized third world women as oppressed and uneducated victims who served their men without question. She disagreed with this assessment. As she noted, quote, "I could not accept this picture. It was not that these things were untrue. They were simply incomplete. To me, the women were not oppressed. They were powerful. They were not weak. They were strong. They were not abject. They were assertive. Why was it that a science aimed at discovering truth was not discovering what I and others felt and saw when it was written about us?" End quote. The kinds of research questions researchers ask are influenced by their personal and academic experiences. The research questions dictate the kinds of research data obtained. The way in which researchers interpret the data is also influenced by their personal and academic experiences. Today, I want to talk about three examples how my personal and academic experience have led me to ask questions that access and convey Indigenous perspectives that challenge the way Canadians view Indigenous history. I want to first talk about Second World War First Nation and Métis veterans, specifically in Saskatchewan. I want to talk about the notion of national histories. And then I want to talk a little bit about Indigenous genocides. These are all research projects that I have either conducted or are about to conduct. In the same way that Hanef talks about anthropologists, these examples point to the incomplete picture historians have drawn of Indigenous history. When looking at the experiences of First Nation and Métis veterans in the post-war period, I came across the kind of narrative that suggested that the political activism that took place immediately after the war was due to the First Nation and Métis veterans. This to me was pretty interesting and very ubiquitous. All the historians that talked about First Nation and Métis people after the war all said the same thing. And James Pasula is someone who kind of exemplifies that tone or that view, as he states, quote, "The increased political activism of Indian people caused by their participation in World War II and to support given the cause by Saskatchewan CCF government." In this quote, he's talking about the linkages between the political activism that was taking place in Saskatchewan and First Nation veterans and the role that the CCF government played. He goes on to say, quote, "War veterans were very much in evidence in politically organizing, underscoring the linkage between Indian political organization and the wartime experience. The image of First Nation veterans returning from the war to lead First Nations political organizations fits nicely with the poetic image of the victorious warrior on the battlefield, continuing the fight for freedom at home. There was one problem with this narrative, however. With all the historians who were writing this, none of them provided any evidence that supported this claim. So for me, I decided that I was going to do research on this topic. And I was influenced by my grandfather, Samson Pelche, who was from Cowesses. He enlisted in the war in 1939 and was over there till 1945 and came home shortly after the war. And it was with his presence in my life really influenced me to want to delve deeper into First Nation and Métis veterans' experiences. And once I was seeing the kind of literature that was out there and the gap in terms of the evidence, I thought, well, this seems like a good research question. And the question I came up with was, what was the socio-political influence of Second World War Saskatchewan First Nation and Métis veterans, 1945 to 1960? So in order to conduct that research, I interviewed 25 veterans from Oceanman in the southeast, during Saskatchewan, to North Battleford and Western Saskatchewan, Cumberland House in Northern Saskatchewan, and many communities in between. I looked at archival records such as the Tommy Douglas paper and the Department of Social Welfare and Rehabilitation papers, government reports, and historical newspaper articles. And based on what I found in these various sources, from the interviews to the various documents, historical documents, I came up with the thesis that First Nation and Métis veterans can be characterized or could be characterized as passive participants in the social and political changes that took place in Saskatchewan in the immediate post-war years. And by that, I meant that, after the hostilities had ended and they're ushered in a new environment political environment for First Nation and Métis people. And part of this was influenced, on one hand, Canadians feeling kind of uncomfortable about the closeness in the way in which First Nation and Métis people were treated by Canada, and what had happened in Germany. In addition, the kinds of the ways in which veterans had been portrayed had changed dramatically from prior to the war, during the beginning of the war, at the end of the war. Before the war, First Nations people were primarily portrayed as 19th century caricatures, bloodthirsty savages, people who had no loyalty to Canada. By the beginning of the war, those same kinds of images were still being used in the newspapers, except that this time, these bloodthirsty savages were fighting for Canada against the Germans, and therefore these were seen now as in positive light. The bloodthirsty savages aspects of First Nations people was seen in a positive light. But halfway through the war, the images started to change. Newspapers started to write about First Nation and Métis soldiers and what they were doing at the front lines. So no longer were they 19th century people, but they were contemporary people. In addition, First Nation and Métis people on the home front were garnering attention from the newspapers with the kinds of drives they were doing to raise money for war bonds or materials for a war effort. And so by the end of the war, newspaper articles were talking about the returning First Nation and Métis veterans in terms of them being heroes. And it's because of this, in news articles, they were saying that First Nations are now ready to become citizens based on their performance in the war. However, First Nations veterans themselves were when they returned, they're much more focused on readjusting to civilian lives. And for many, that meant trying to find jobs and jobs that they could never have obtained before the war, jobs that would take them from Saskatchewan to British Columbia or Saskatchewan to Ontario, jobs that were far away. Prior to the war, traveling was very difficult. I talked to a man who lived in Lebret, a Métis man who lived in Lebret. He said, if you wanted to go to Regina, which is like a 45-minute drive now, it would take all day to go there by horse and buggy. And you basically had to be rich to go to Regina. This was prior to the war. So after the war, people left, and people, they were not really ready to settle down for the most part. Veterans, for the most part, were politically inexperienced. They had more battlefield experiences in Europe than adult experiences in Canada. And as a result, they had very little to do with the political organizing that took place in Canada immediately after the war. However, their presence was very much needed, as they were then, because they were seen as being progressive, and therefore was a justification for First Nations people to have greater rights and responsibility. And this led to a joint Senate and House of Commons committee to look into revisions of the Indian Act, which happened in 1946 and 47, and then eventually to the major overhaul of the Indian Act in 1952. The veteran, so yes.
Can I just interrupt here? So we're still working on the PowerPoint thing, which is entirely my fault. And thank you for everybody for your patience. But we can't see your video for some reason. So I'm just wondering if maybe you can flip it back on there. And
you mean I'm not even,
you're not, we get your voice and we get your powerful words. So it's all good. But
Okay.
I think we also would like to see if that's at all possible.
Okay. Okay. Because I'm using my PowerPoint as partially as my
For your notes, yeah, absolutely. And we would all love to see your PowerPoint, but Adele kind of did a number. So, you know, let this all go down in history as the moment where Adele set the Zoom settings in really strange ways that are very hard to redo in a meeting, but we are working on it. Maybe Rob, I don't know if you can kind of close down the slides and then open it up on another screen. That might work.
I know I got another screen. Yeah, I got another screen here. So
sorry about that.
I might be going like this a little bit, but
my apologies. It's all my fault. Let this be said again.
I can do like this. Okay. All right. Okay. What? What did I say?
You got to the, but we still don't see you, oddly enough.
Really? Oh, wait a sec.
Okay.
That's because, how do I do that then? Okay. Yeah, can you see me now?
Nope.
No. Oh, my video is off. What was my video?
Oh, there you are.
Geez, what, you know, how did I must have turned it off at some point.
We can see you now.
I set the mojo in motion with screen staring stuff. So my apologies. Okay. Thanks,
okay.
Rob.
Okay. Alrighty. No one left. Oh, that's good.
Thank you very much.
Okay. So I'll just kind of finish off with what I was talking about, whatever that was, by saying that the veterans themselves had no real influence on or direct impact on the political activism that was going on immediately after the war. And I'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is was the idea of tribal histories. Now, this kind of came about. This notion about tribal history came about in my research, looking at Cowesses First Nation, my First Nation, the contemporary kinship practices on Cowesses First Nation. Just to give a little bit of context, 80% of the band membership lives off reserve, and that means that there are multiple generations who have been removed from living on the reserve. People started to leave the reserve about in the 1940s and 50s, and once they for education or for employment, and the men who left, many married non-status Indian women, and of course, but were still able to pass on their status. Many of the women also married non-status Indians, but lost their status. But yet either way, since there were multiple generations of people living off reserve, some who were eligible for Bill C-31, others who had maintained their status but had been disconnected from the reserve. And what I found when I was doing research on the veterans was that the people on the reserve, because I had interviewed a number of veterans from Cowesses, and what I realized was there were Cowesses seemed to have a welcoming kind of Cowesses people seem to have this welcoming kind of attitude towards Bill C-31 members and disconnected members. Even with a high level of off-reserve members and relatives, this was evident. And whether or not they were non-status Indians at that point, or were Bill C-31 members, or were still had maintained their status. So that got me to think, well, that seems a little bit different than the message that that was out there in the newspapers in the 80s and 90s when Bill C-31 was first implemented. That message being that there was real conflict from the old members with the new members. And there's a lot of people that really didn't want the Bill C-31s to come back to the reserve. They didn't want people there. There was a lot of fear about budgetary concerns because of the band membership would grow, but the budget wasn't going to grow. People in Cowesses that I encountered in the 90s were like welcoming, wanting people to come and visit the reserve. People who hadn't, whether they were C-31s or disconnected members. So for me, the question then arose was, what was the basis for the Cowesses contemporary kinship practices? And so for me to answer these questions, I looked at the historical literature, and the historical literature typically, it's like you're looking at, this is a literature review, but this was more than just a literature review that I was, when I first thought, well, yeah, this is kind of a literature review. I'm identifying the gaps and the themes and how my research can fit in the existing literature. But it was more than that, because what I found was that the literature spoke and talked about Plains people in a particular kind of way that had an impact on Indigenous identities of Plains people. So I looked at the historical literature. I looked at government reports. I looked at TLE claims, and I interviewed 25 band members. And so based on these data sources, I came up with the argument that Cowesses contemporary kinship practices were based on customary law that are embedded in the traditional stories, such as Wissahickachuk stories, that have they have been practicing since before they settled on the reserve. Now, when I was looking at the historical literature, I looked at all the stuff that was published about Indigenous people on the prairies, specifically looking at Treaty 4, but I was looking at Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, whether they're Treaty 4 or none. And the major ones, for example, I looked at Sarah Carter's seminal work, The Lost Harvest, Prairie Indian Reserves Indian Reserve Farmers and Government Policy, Catherine Pettipas, Severing the Ties That Bind, Government Repression of Indigenous Religious Ceremonies on the Prairies, Laura Pierce, the Jubwa of Western Canada, of course, David Mandelbaum, the anthropologist, the Plains Cree, and John Tobias's Subjugation of the Plains Cree. Those are just examples of the kinds of sources that I was looking at. And there was a theme that ran in with all of these histories, is that they presented the histories of the Indigenous people on the prairies as tribal histories, in that they were distinct from each other. For example, Sarah Carter, and this was not to pick on Sarah Carter's great work, but nonetheless, this was emblematic of way in which Indigenous people on the prairies were talked about. Quote, of course I have to burp now, quote, the Plains Cree bands in the district covering Treaty 4 concluded in 1874 are the focus of this study. They lived west of the Saulteaux of the parkland and included Saulteaux, Assiniboine, and mixed bloods among their number, end quote. While Carter acknowledges that bands comprise members of other groups, they are nonetheless portrayed essentially as Plains Cree. However, that didn't really reflect the reality of Cowesses First Nation and many other bands in Treaty 4 and Treaty 6. Cowesses had a large population of Plains Cree, Saulteaux, Assiniboine, and Métis, and English half-breeds, and others. And the thing about that was interesting, it was that unlike, say, Pie Pot. Now, Pie Pot was a band in southern Saskatchewan Treaty 4 territory that anthropologist named Susan CHRR wrote about in the 70s. And she talked about how the Pie Pot's band were the Young Dogs, and how they were a Cree and Assiniboine band. But they were a Cree and Assiniboine band that amalgamated, that so no longer were they Cree, no longer were they Assiniboine, but they're Cree Assiniboine. They had a hybrid culture that combined the both into a new culture. However, Cowesses was not necessarily like that. For example, in the early 1900s, about 30 years after people had settled on the reserve, Alison Skinner, an anthropologist, went to Cowesses, collected some Risakachuk stories from Cree and Saulteaux people, and he had talked to some of the Saulteaux and said that they were still using the Eagle and Blue Jay clans. However, the Plains Cree, didn't have clans. So 30 years after, people were still using their clans. The Saulteaux were still using clans. They hadn't disappeared at that point. And back in the 90s, I was on the reserve, and I was talking to Elder Adele Esagan. And she was telling me that my grandfather, he spoke half-breed Cree. Now, I assumed that the half-breed Cree was, Cree English or Cree French, but because, we have Métis ancestors in our family. But she said, no, there was a Cree Saulteaux language mix. It's like an OG Cree, like Cree Saulteaux mix. So there was a little bit of cultural sharing going on. So I asked the elder, did you understand this language? Did you speak this language? She said no, because I'm Assiniboine, right? So by the 1990s, well over 100 years after, she was still Assiniboine. She wasn't Cree, she wasn't Saulteaux, and so there was Cowesses, like many other bands in Treaty 4 and Treaty 6, were these multicultural bands, and not multicultural in the multiculturalism of the Canadian government kind of thing. No, these are multiple cultural groups in one band that were distinct from one another. So it was like, well, how is it that Cowesses people were able to incorporate different people into the band in a way that allowed them to maintain their distinct cultural identities? How were Métis accepted into the band when they are always described as being distinct from First Nations people, distinct, and usually distinct culturally and racially? The reason is that they all shared an understanding of the way that kinship works. Kinship practices were literally a matter of life and death. In order to, people traditionally wanted to incorporate people from other bands into their band, thereby creating kinship links to other bands that then you could depend on in time of scarcity of resources or war, so on. And so literally, kinship was incorporating people who are not necessarily from your cultural group was a matter of life. Kinship, therefore, guided by the values embedded in the stories, such as Risakachuk and others, were, as Mary Campbell called, the law of the people. They guided the interactions of the people, and they spelled out the normative behaviors that people were expected to follow. feel like I'm really talking fast. And so it was these stories that allowed Cowesses, even though they had been dealing with assimilation, it was these stories and the values embedded in these stories that allowed Cowesses to maintain aspects of their traditional kinship practices and one was to be welcoming through those band members who are BLC 31 or were relatives who had been disconnected from the reserve. While I was doing my research for this particular research, I came across the issue of the starvation policy, which of course I had first read as an undergraduate student with John Tobias's seminal, subjugation of the Plains Cree. And at that time, when I first read it, it was kind of abstract in terms of, relating to me. However, during my research, it became clear that Cowesses band was at the Cypress Hills during the time of the starvation policy and was directly impacted. Now, to give a little bit of context of what was happening after the treaties were signed, the Treaty 4 and Treaty 6, which was signed in 1876, the buffalo in Saskatchewan are basically disappearing, and many of the bands decided that they would congregate down the Cypress Hills, which is in southeastern Saskatchewan, right around the border, close to Montana and close to Alberta, and launch into Alberta and Montana to get to the buffalo. And the estimated population, it's very difficult to ascertain, but cobbling together the various historians' rough estimates, I've estimated that, by the time of the starvation policy in 1882-ish, that there was between 13,000 and 16,000 First Nation and Métis people down at the Cypress Hills at that point. For the government, however, they didn't want the First Nations people and Métis people in Cypress Hills. For one thing, it was such a large concentration of people, they were too difficult to control. And for another was that, the CPR was being built, and the CPR was going to be built right through Regina, straight to Calgary. And that would put the CPR just north of the Cypress Hills. And they wanted to assure settlers that the Indians were not going to be trouble, right? So people were scared that First Nation and Métis people would attack them, and so they wanted to assure that the safety. So they wanted to get rid of First Nation people out of that area. They wanted to assert control of them, and they wanted to assure the settlers that the West was safe. So the government decided, among other things, to close Fort Walsh. Now, Fort Walsh was the Northwest Mounted Police fort located in Fort Walsh. Located in the Cypress Hills. And it was a food distribution center. The government knew that the level of starvation and that was going on, and to alleviate that, they used Fort Walsh as a food distribution center. However, they decided that they would close the fort and would only give rations to people if they went back to their treaty territories, which was either in the North Battleford region with Treaty 6 area or along the Qu'Appelle Valley with Treaty 4 territories. So that meant that people would have to leave the Fort Walsh and Cypress Hills areas and go back to these places, which were hundreds of kilometers away. And as a result of the starvation policy, many people died. However, historians have never actually ascertained the number of people that died because according to historians, there's no way to find out. And in some ways they're right, because there were no death certificates. Or without death certificates, it's very difficult to find out how many people died. However, Cowesses, and this is how I kind of found out about all this, because when I was doing my research on kinship, I was looking at the Cowesses treated land entitlement research claim. Now, a part of that research claim, the band submitted a land claim for treated land entitlement, and they determined that 320 of its 1,000 members had died. They had disappeared from the historical documents. About 33% of the population had just disappeared from the historical documents. They argued that those people disappeared because they had died as a result of the starvation policy. The government said, nah, they didn't check. They probably took script, went to another band, or maybe they went to Montana and North Dakota and went down to a reservation with relatives down there, or they took script, or something like this, right? So the band went through the script records, went through the band list of on both sides of the borders, looked at, and they also looked at the Hudson's Bay archives, because the Hudson Bay, was the only store in town, and this is where people went and they dealt on credit, and people names were in the ledger book, and none of these people were there. And the government then accepted the Cowesses claim that these people were actually part of their band, that they had died due to starvation policy, and were then a part of the land claim. Now, if the death rate is similar with all the other bands, because Cowesses was just one of many bands that were down at Cypress Hills, and if the death rate was the same for all the other bands as it was for Cowesses, we're talking between 1,500 and 5,300 people having perished as a result of the policy. Now, to put it in a little bit of context, 4,000 Cherokees died as a result along the Trail of Tears. Yet, so few Canadians have ever heard about the deaths that took place at Cypress Hills. So the question then I have is, well, how many First Nation and Métis people died in the Cypress Hills as a result of starvation policy implemented by the government? Now, this is a research project that I'm going to just at the beginning stage. And to look to answer that question, I'll be following the same research methodology as Cowesses. I'll be looking at the annuity pay list. I'll be looking at script records. I'll be looking at the band list, and I'll be looking at the Hudson's Bay archives. So what? My Mushum Samson Pelche, he's a picture right here of him, had a huge impact on me, and he led me to ask questions about First Nation and Métis veterans. The story of the veterans, fit into the view white people have of Indigenous people, not only because of the romantic image of coming back and fighting the good fight, but also this other image of Indigenous people that white people have, that Indigenous people cannot be successful without direct involvement of white people. So many people, the story that that they went to war, and when they came back, they led their fight. This was part of the idea that it was their interaction with white people in the army, white people in Europe, being in Europe, the seeing all the civilization, and then coming back, right? And when I was talking to the veterans, and this is kind of similar when during the white paper and the First Nations First Nation leaders had all these criticisms of the white paper, and Jean Chrétien, the Minister of Indigenous Affairs at that time, said of the criticism that these were that the Indian leaders were being led astray by a whole bunch of white do-gooders, right? Because it couldn't have been the criticisms, they couldn't have come from First Nations leaders. It had to be from someone who's leading them astray. White people were leading them astray. And in that same way, it's like First Nations veterans couldn't have been, had a work ethic before the war, or they had the work ethic from the war and from their direct involvement with white people. Most of the people I talked to told me of their experiences prior to going to the war, and that included hunting, being laborers, either farming and construction, fishing. These are highly intensive labor intensive work. They had to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to milk or do milk cows or whatever. And, veterans themselves, for the first half dozen or so, were telling me that the Army taught them how to work hard. It wasn't until about the 5th or 6th or 7th one, I started, wait a second, but weren't you doing all this kind of this and this and this before the war? And the vet just said, yeah, I guess I did. Well, I guess the Army just kind of reinforced my work ethic, right? He hadn't, so, in a lot of ways that, veterans were, being, humble but they would be telling everybody that, they learned their work ethic from the Army, from their direct interaction with white people. Not only that, these stories also erases the role and impact of those leaders who were in charge of the political movement prior, during, and after the war. And that the activism that would happen after the war didn't just happen. The activism was starting in Saskatchewan since the time almost directly after they signed treaty, when they started to agitate for the treaties to be renegotiated, and continued for each generation after that. And it wasn't the war, it wasn't coming back from the war. It wasn't 1969, the white paper. It wasn't Oka. It wasn't I don't know more. These were not the start of any, these were the continuation of the political activism that Indigenous people have been engaged in with the Canadian state since the Canadian state have been trying to take control of their lives. The tribal histories attempt to fit Indigenous political structures into Euro-Western notions of, oh, here we are, the Euro-Western notions of nation states. There were no Cree, Saulteaux, Assiniboine, or Métis nations, at least not in the nation state sense. People in Treaty 4, Treaty 6 territories were organized in bands. They were band societies that were structurally flexible and durable for the socio-political milieu they were geographically situated in. The bands were based on kinship practices that ensured the survival of the people. Breaking down Indigenous kinship practices is a genocidal strategy the government employs. If we lose our ties to our kinship obligations and responsibilities based on the law of the people, we lose our ties to each other and to the land. If that happens, how can we still be Cree, Saulteaux, Assiniboine, or Métis? Histories that erase the complexity in which Indigenous people organize themselves unwittingly or not, work to weaken Indigenous sovereignty. Since the release of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission 94 calls to action, there has been a lot of conversation about genocide. Most of the conversation has been around, whether or not cultural genocide counts as real genocide. Esteemed historians like Jim Miller, my former MA supervisor, and Donald Smith have argued that genocide does not apply to residential schools. After the discoveries of the 215 unmarked graves at the Kamloops Residential School, and then the unmarked and then the 751 at the Maribel Residential School on Cowesses, where undoubtedly I know I have relatives buried. The Canadian Historical Association released a statement saying that genocide does apply to residential schools, though it was met with criticism in an open letter from another group of historians who vehemently disagreed. The TRC and the unmarked graves at Kamloops and Cowesses and the other communities are significant, as they have forced many Canadians to acknowledge what happened at those schools. However, these conversations, though these conversations are important, they seem to assume that Canada never committed the mass killing form of genocide. Though the starvation policy has received scholarly attention from historians, no scholar or politician has called the deaths that resulted a genocide. And in many ways, starvation policy is almost a euphemism for genocide. The government knew First Nations and Métis people were starving. They had received numerous letters. All the historians have documented the letters from the field that Dewdney, the Indian Affairs Commissioner and Lieutenant Governor, when he came out, he saw it with his own eyes. The people were starving. They knew that the situation was dire. That they knew that First Nation and Métis people depended on the food rations from Fort Walsh. They would have known that closing the fort and making them walk 100 kilometers would lead to more deaths. And it did. The kinds of research questions I ask are deeply influenced by my personal experiences and academic training. I'm not really interested in challenging Canadians' views on Indigenous history. I don't really know if my interpretation challenges anyone's views. The kinds of questions that I'm interested in asking are more about wanting to know how First Nations and Métis people navigated the onslaught of colonization. How did they respond, and why did they respond the way they did to the obstacles placed in front of them by the colonizers, Canadian provincial governments, and everyday Canadians? Why are we still here as Indigenous people? We shouldn't be. With the kinds of assimilation policies and genocidal attempts on our lives, we should not be here. As a people, we should be assimilated. For me, the histories I read as an undergraduate and graduate student, and still read at times, or like Hanef, or sometimes, like Hanef, not necessarily, quote, untrue, they were simply incomplete, end quote. The stories of the continued Indigenous resistance is much more complicated than we have been led to believe, and no doubt are still incomplete. But these are the stories that I am interested in asking questions about.
Oh, thank you very, very much for that, Dr. Innes. That was amazingly rich and grounded and powerful talk. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say it was actually especially powerful because we got to hear you, and despite our technological drama of making it so you were not able to show the slides as you planned, I think that was a wonderful and really powerful presentation.